The South Side was buzzing after the shot stopped. A teenage girl in skinny jeans and a hoodie had just slipped away from a block where the pavement still smoked from shell casings. Witnesses swore she smiled as she tweeted minutes later, mocking the boy left bleeding behind. The streets got plenty of stories like that, and some of the wildest ones belong. But before Barnes, before the heroin queens and cartel bosses of the late 20th century, women in crime were rarely seen as leaders. To understand the shift, you first need to know what came before the 1980s. Before the mid-80s, women in American gang life were rarely taken seriously. They were often labeled as girlfriends or hangarounds. Yet in reality, they were moving money, hiding weapons, and running safe houses, while law enforcement largely overlooked them. That invisibility became a weapon police would stop a man on the corner instantly, but a woman carrying the same package often walked away untouched. By the 1960s and 70s, court records already showed women being arrested alongside male counterparts, but their names never made headlines. The myth persisted that they were passive until the drug trade, and especially the crack era, blew that narrative apart. When cocaine demand exploded, women who once played supporting roles stepped forward, running crews, building connections, and in some cases, ordering violence. Poverty and over-policing of young Black and Latino men left power vacuums in many neighborhoods. Women filled them, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by ambition, and quickly proved they could be as ruthless and effective as any man on the block. Gender stereotypes worked in their favor. The assumption that women weren't leaders allowed them to build empires in plain sight until investigators realized they were calling the shots. Respect in the streets came only through dominance, and women learned they had to outthink and outwork rivals while showing they could be violent if crossed. Some leaned into being underestimated, striking only when it counted. Others projected hardness from day one. Either way, their reputations grew. The mid-80s media frenzy over cocaine cowboys and East Coast drug wars rarely spotlighted women, but they were there, signing deals, laundering money, and shaping the same violent economies. By the time law enforcement caught on, some of these women had built names that lasted longer than the men beside them. The idea that gangs were male-only domains was always false, but the 1980s shattered it outright. Women were no longer in the background. They were players who shifted power in whole cities. And from that chaos, legends were born. Once the mid-80s started making the streets wild, one name was already legendary far beyond American borders, and that was Griselda Blanco. She was born on February 15, 1943, in Cartagena, Colombia, before growing up in Medellin, where she picked up early lessons in crime. Reports say she was running scams and robberies as a teenager, building the kind of reputation that followed her for life. The streets back then were already drenched in hustlers, and Griselda figured out survival meant taking risks most people feared. By the 1970s, she had moved from Colombia into New York City, where she started carving a path in the cocaine trade. Her crew got tied into networks bringing Colombian cocaine through Miami and New York, making millions as demand exploded in the United States. She was running heavy weight through contacts with Medellin suppliers, putting her right in the early building blocks of the Colombian drug pipeline. Federal indictments in New York in 1975 listed her name in a major cocaine conspiracy case that forced her to flee back to Colombia. She dodged those charges, but her network kept growing while the cocaine trade got more violent every year. By the late 1970s, she had set up shop in Miami, and that city would become her empire. The cocaine cowboys era was already heating up, and Blanco was right in the middle of it. Miami turned into a war zone as her crew battled rivals in daylight shootouts, filling newspapers with stories about dead bodies on the streets. Authorities connected her to hundreds of killings, though the confirmed number was much lower. She was ruthless enough that her name alone made rivals nervous, because she was known to order murders without hesitation. She allegedly introduced a method of killing that Miami police had never really seen before: the motorcycle drive-by. Hitmen would roll up with a passenger on the back, spraying bullets at rivals, then disappearing into traffic. That tactic became a signature of her operations, and it added to the bloody legend attached to her name. The Miami Herald in the early 1980s was filled with reports of daylight assassinations tied to cocaine wars, and Blanco's crew was constantly suspected. She earned the nickname the Black Widow because 3 of her husbands ended up dead under suspicious circumstances. Investigators long believed she ordered the killings when relationships soured, showing how personal life and business life blended for her. One ex-husband, Alberto Bravo, reportedly died in Bogota during a confrontation where Blanco herself survived a gun battle. These stories fueled the idea that she was colder than even her male counterparts because no bond stopped her from making a lethal decision. The money coming in was wild, with investigators estimating she was pulling in $80 million a month during her peak years. She set up a distribution system that stretched from Miami to California, using couriers who carried drugs in hidden compartments. One story even claims she used lingerie with special stitching to hide packages, giving women a role in smuggling that police overlooked. DEA records in the 1980s put her network as one of the largest single cocaine pipelines into the United States. Blanco lived big while Miami bled. She reportedly bought mansions, luxury cars, and jewelry, while also raising children in the middle of her empire. The cocaine wars in Miami during the late 1970s and early 1980s became infamous because of her. Names like Jorge Rivi Ayala, one of her contract killers, surfaced in investigations linking her to countless executions. The violence got so intense that law enforcement created specialized task forces just to deal with the chaos. Her reputation went beyond facts into rumors that added to her myth. Stories circulated that she once plotted to kidnap John F. Kennedy Jr. in the 1980s as leverage against U.S. authorities. There was never evidence that the plan advanced, but the rumor itself showed how bold her name had become. Another claim suggested she kidnapped and killed a child back in Colombia after a ransom was unpaid, a detail repeated in multiple biographies, though never confirmed. These tales turned her into a figure larger than life, somewhere between gangster history and urban legend. Eventually, law enforcement caught her slipping. In 1985, federal agents arrested her in Irvine, California, charging her with the drug trafficking. She was convicted and sent to federal prison, where she stayed for nearly 20 years. During her prison years, prosecutors in Florida tried connecting her to multiple murders, including the infamous killing of a 2-year-old boy during a botched hit. Contract killer Jorge Rivi Ayala testified against her, but procedural issues damaged the case, sparing her from additional convictions. She ended up only convicted of 3 murders, far below the body count law enforcement believed she carried. After finishing her sentence, she was deported back to Colombia in 2004. Many people thought her story might fade quietly at that point, but her name never lost weight. On September 3, 2012, at 69 years old, she was shot and killed in Medellin by a motorcycle gunman outside a butcher shop. That detail alone echoed the exact killing method she had made famous decades earlier, closing her life with poetic irony. Colombian police called it a professional hit, reminding everyone that her enemies never truly disappeared. Griselda Blanco's legacy sits at a strange place between truth and myth. Documentaries like Cocaine Cowboys kept her story alive for new generations, painting her as a central figure in Miami's violent drug history. Netflix later dramatized her life, building on the legend that has surrounded her for decades. But those who lived through that Miami chaos remember the blood on the sidewalks, the open daylight shootouts, and the families destroyed by her cocaine pipeline. For them, her name is not just a Netflix story, it is a reminder of one of the deadliest chapters in American drug history. Her story proves how a woman could move through male-dominated streets and flip invisibility into power, carving a legacy written in money and blood. She controlled Miami when the cocaine trade exploded, and her reputation still gets studied in law enforcement files and criminology classes today. Griselda Blanco, the cocaine godmother, was proof that danger never cared about gender, only ambition and the willingness to take lives. Out in Northeast Los Angeles, there is a small block called Drew Street, and for years that block carried a heavy reputation. By the mid-1980s, the Avenues gang was already known in Highland Park and Glassell Park, but Drew Street became a fortress under one woman named Maria Chata Leon. She was an immigrant from Mexico, a short woman in her 40s, with 13 kids, and she turned her family into a clique that locked down the street. Her home on Drew Street became famous and feared, a modest stucco house with a giant black satellite dish on the roof. Neighbors called it the Satellite House, and it was packed with drugs, guns, and even booby traps like laser tripwires. Police raids on that house uncovered shrines dedicated to Jesus Malverde, the so-called narco saint that traffickers prayed to for protection. That house stood as the command post for one of the most violent cliques in Los Angeles. Maria Leon ran the block like a general with soldiers, except her soldiers were her own children and nephews. Multiple sons became key members of the Drew Street clique, and residents described the family moving together like an army. Kids stood as lookouts on corners, while older sons handled drug sales and intimidation. People in the neighborhood said that when Chata barked orders, even the hardest gangbangers followed her voice. She wasn't just a mother raising kids, she was a matriarch running an empire. The violence tied to Drew Street was nonstop. By the 1990s, residents reported nightly gunfire, constant drug sales, and intimidation so deep that people refused to call police. At one point, authorities said Drew Street alone accounted for nearly 20% of all violent crime in that police division. Shootings, murders, and assaults piled up year after year, with the Leon family constantly tied to the action. Even rival gangs respected the Drew Street crew because crossing them meant risking a deadly response. The community lived in fear because everyone knew the house with the satellite dish controlled the block. Cars with tinted windows cruised through, lookouts posted on rooftops, and buyers lined up for drugs at all hours. Police tried raiding the house multiple times, but Maria Leon always seemed to bounce back. The myth around her grew with each failed attempt to shut her down, and residents felt trapped in a neighborhood controlled by one family. By the early 2000s, federal investigators started building a major RICO case to bring the Drew Street clique down. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act gave prosecutors the ability to charge Maria Leon and her sons as part of an organized criminal enterprise. Surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover buys slowly built a picture of how drugs moved from Mexico through Drew Street and into Los Angeles. They documented how the Leon family ran the trade like a business, using violence as insurance. In 2008, the federal RICO indictment hit hard, and Maria Chata Leon was finally taken down. She was convicted on racketeering charges and sentenced to more than 8 years in prison. Police also demolished the satellite house in 2009, tearing down what they called a monument to gang power. Neighbors cheered as the house came down, believing that only demolition could erase the shadow that building cast over Drew Street. Even locked up, Maria Leon remained defiant, and her legend grew through television profiles and news reports. Shows like Gangsters, America's Most Evil called her the mother of the avenues, documenting how she turned motherhood into gang leadership. Investigators admitted that she was one of the rare female shot callers in Los Angeles who controlled an entire clique, something usually reserved for men in that world. Her ability to command fear and loyalty made her story stand out. Maria Chata Leon's reign showed how a single family could dominate a block and how one woman could become the center of a violent network. She raised children into soldiers, built a fortress house into a headquarters, and made Drew Street a name whispered with fear across Los Angeles. Her removal gave the neighborhood a chance to breathe, but her story still lingers as proof that women could sit in the highest seat of street power. By the 1990s, the Bronx was drowning in heroin, and one of the most feared names tied to that scene was Rosalie Garcia. She was a small woman, barely 5'3", but her reach in the South Bronx was enormous. People called her Shorty, and that nickname stuck to her empire just like the drugs she sold. Her main base of operations was a building on Howe Avenue, a location that became infamous across the borough. That address was no regular apartment building. It was the heart of her heroin ring. Neighbors described it like hell on earth, filled with addicts, dealers, and gunmen guarding the territory. Investigators later estimated that the Howe Avenue crew pulled in around $70,000 every week from heroin sales. For a neighborhood already buried under poverty, that kind of money turned one building into a fortress. Violence followed the money, and Shorty ruled with intimidation that shocked even seasoned investigators. Prosecutors later revealed that her organization ordered hits on rivals and suspected informants, using murder as a business tool. One victim was a federal informant, shot dead inside a Bronx stairwell, a killing carried out to send a message that nobody could cross her. The building became so tied to death that families feared even walking past, knowing bullets or overdoses were just part of the scenery. Her son, Manuel Garcia, became her closest partner, working alongside her to enforce control over the heroin operation. Together, they ran a network that kept the Bronx supplied with steady product, backed by threats and violence. The mother and son duo became a nightmare for law enforcement because both were willing to sanction deadly force when their power was challenged. Investigators said Rosalie Garcia was no silent partner. She was the calculating mastermind behind the entire setup. By 2005, the federal government brought racketeering charges against her, finally pulling years of surveillance and evidence into a courtroom. During trial, prosecutors painted Shorty as a cold operator who treated human lives as nothing but obstacles. Witnesses described how she carried herself like a leader, always keeping control even when families of victims cried in court. She showed no visible remorse, which only deepened the fear that her name carried. The jury convicted her of racketeering and 4 murders, tying her directly to the violence surrounding her heroin business. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 25 years, ensuring she would never see freedom again. Manuel received the same fate, locked away for life after being found guilty of the same crimes. Federal authorities called it one of the most significant Bronx heroin convictions of that decade. The story shocked many who knew her casually, because Shorty looked like a harmless woman to people outside the game. Neighbors recalled her appearing kind when speaking in bodegas or greeting people on the block. That gentle image disguised the ruthless power she held over a heroin empire. It was that combination, a petite woman hiding lethal control, that made her story stand out in gang history. Rosalie Garcia's case has since been featured in shows like Gangsters, America's Most Evil, in an episode called Lethal Beauties. Reporters covering her trial repeated how strange it was to see a woman of her size wield so much authority over drug crews filled with hardened men. The streets, though, already knew that her soft voice and small frame meant nothing when she had soldiers moving dope and ordering deaths in her name. Her fall marked the end of one of the most dangerous heroin crews in the Bronx, but the scars left on Hope Avenue never disappeared. Families lost children to overdoses, rivals lost lives to bullets, and neighbors carried fear for years. Rosalie "Shorty" Garcia showed that control in the streets doesn't always come from size or muscle. Sometimes it comes from cold calculation and the willingness to use violence without hesitation. The streets don't always crown the loudest hustler. Sometimes the crown falls on somebody who never planned to wear it. That was the case in Philadelphia when a woman named Thelma Wright turned tragedy into one of the most unexpected runs in the heroin game. Her husband, Jackie Wright, was already deep in Philadelphia's black mafia, moving weight through a network that fed the city through the mid-1980s. In 1986, Jackie was murdered in a brutal killing that left Thelma widowed and staring at the kind of choice most people never imagined. She could step away completely, or she could pick up the reins of the empire her husband left behind. Thelma chose the second path, and it shocked many who knew her because she didn't just keep things steady, she expanded. Reports from Philadelphia law enforcement during the late 1980s documented her making runs to Los Angeles, setting up supply lines that connected West Coast cocaine with East Coast heroin. Investigators noted how her ability to travel back and forth without drawing heavy suspicion kept her network strong when others were falling. She wasn't just moving quietly either, because her reputation on the streets grew through bold negotiation tactics that showed she could match any rival. One story from Philadelphia's underworld tells of her walking into a tense meeting with a shotgun in her hands, forcing everyone to recognize that she wasn't there to play. That kind of boldness cemented her status, and people started calling her Boss Lady as her influence spread through the black mafia's operations. The money flowed heavy, and Thelma learned how to make it look legitimate through multiple fronts. She invested in hair salons and upscale real estate properties, turning drug money into businesses that could clean her profits. The combination of real estate deals and flashy parties gave her the appearance of a successful businesswoman, while in reality, the streets were fueling it all. Witnesses later described her houses filled with cash stuffed into bags, showing just how much her operation pulled in. Unlike many others caught in the chaos of the drug trade, Thelma developed something rare in that world: an exit plan. By the early 1990s, she had lost too many friends and seen too many funerals, and the paranoia of watching her back every day started to wear her down. She eventually stepped away from the business while still at the height of her power, a move that surprised both her crew and law enforcement. Federal prosecutors chased the black mafia across multiple cases, but Thelma managed to avoid major prison time by the time she retired. That survival only added to her legend, because in the streets, making money is one thing, but walking away alive and free is something almost nobody manages. For her, the timing was everything, and she left before the walls closed in completely. Years later, she told her story in a memoir called With Eyes from Both Sides, breaking down how she balanced the glamorous life with the dangerous one. She spoke publicly about the lure of fast money, describing duffel bags of cash, car chases on Philadelphia highways, and tense face-offs with rivals. The book gave readers a window into the life of a woman who was never supposed to be a queen pin, but ended up proving she could thrive in the role. She later became a motivational speaker, traveling and sharing her story as a warning about how the fast life can leave scars. In interviews, she admitted that leaving the drug game was the best decision she ever made, even though part of her still carried the weight of those years. Thelma Wright turned her experience into a tool for teaching others, showing how survival sometimes means knowing when to walk away. Her story remains one of the most unique in American gang history because she stands as a rare example of a woman who stepped into a kingpin role, expanded an empire, and then chose to retire before prison or death claimed her. In the streets of Philadelphia, her name carried respect because she proved that leadership didn't always have to look like what people expected. For Thelma, it looked like calm strategy, bold actions, and eventually the wisdom to leave before everything collapsed. Philly had Thelma walking away clean, but out west in Los Angeles, the story was different because Jemiker Thompson leaned in deeper when life tried to break her. She was born in 1966 and raised in South Central Los Angeles, a neighborhood already buzzing with gangs and the early stages of the drug game. By the time she reached her teenage years, the crack epidemic was just beginning to reshape the city. Streets filled with dealers, addicts, and gunshots, an opportunity for anyone willing to take the risks. Jemiker saw survival through hustling, and she found her path through the cocaine trade. Her partner in the game was Anthony "Daff" Mosley, a man already known for his moves in Los Angeles. Together, they built a drug empire that fit perfectly into the crack era of the mid-1980s. The product flowed heavy, and their network supplied blocks across the city while also stretching into other regions. The profits were staggering, and they lived with a level of flash that told everybody they had arrived. Jemiker made sure her life looked legitimate on the surface, running a boutique and hosting hair shows across Los Angeles. These businesses were not just for appearances, because they doubled as money laundering fronts and gave her a reputation as a successful entrepreneur. She drove nice cars, wore the best clothes, and turned her business image into a shield against law enforcement suspicion. People in Los Angeles began to recognize her, not only as a dealer, but also as a businesswoman who played the part convincingly. Her personal life turned violent when tragedy struck in 1987. Anthony "Daff" Mosley was shot and killed, leaving Jemiker widowed and holding the weight of their empire alone. Many people expected her to fade away without her partner, but she did the opposite. She expanded the operation, strengthening connections with suppliers and tightening her grip on distribution. Her decision to keep pushing showed she had the ambition and toughness to run things herself. Through the late 1980s and early 1990s, her empire continued to thrive. She was moving weight in bulk, sometimes 50 kilos at a time, according to later accounts. Federal investigators started paying close attention, realizing she was one of the few women sitting at the top of Los Angeles's crack trade. She had the discipline to keep her crew in line, and nobody doubted her willingness to punish betrayal. The combination of brains, business, and brutality made her one of the most powerful women in the Los Angeles underworld. Her downfall came through betrayal, a classic story in the streets. A man nicknamed Cheese, who was romantically tied to her, became an informant for federal investigators. He fed them details of her operation, her movements, and her safe houses, giving the government the evidence they needed. Jemiker went on the run for 2 years, bouncing between locations while trying to keep the business alive. The chase became legendary in Los Angeles because she was constantly one step ahead of capture. Her arrest in 1993 was dramatic and unforgettable. Federal agents suspected she would attend her son's 6th grade graduation despite being on the run. They set up surveillance at the school, and she showed up in disguise, determined to see her boy walk across the stage. Agents moved in, and she was taken into custody in front of a stunned crowd. That moment sealed her fall, and the media immediately tied her story to the broader collapse of Los Angeles's crack empires. Jemiker Thompson was convicted of drug trafficking and conspiracy, earning a 15-year federal prison sentence. She served 13 years before being released in 2005, and during her prison stretch, she underwent a major transformation. She became an ordained evangelical minister, dedicating her life to preaching second chances and speaking against the fast life that once consumed her. Her testimony carried weight because she had lived the high points and the low points of the game. Her story gained new life after her release through documentaries and television features. She appeared in BET's American Gangster, Trap Queens, and other true crime programs, telling her side of the rise and fall. She admitted openly that at her peak she had it all, pointing to stacks of cash, luxury clothes, and even a Rolls Royce as symbols of her power. Yet she used those interviews to stress that everything built in the crack era eventually collapsed, and the price was always too high. Street lore continues to follow her, including rumors that she buried millions of dollars in cash somewhere during her run. Jemiker has never confirmed or denied the rumor, usually laughing it off in interviews, but the legend adds to her mystique. People on the streets of Los Angeles still whisper about where the money might be, proof that her legacy never faded completely. Jemiker Thompson's story is a reminder that women were not just surviving in the crack era, they were building empires. She rose from South Central roots to command a network that stretched across cities, and when betrayal brought her down, she reinvented herself into a voice for redemption. The Queen Pin of Los Angeles lived a life that balanced glamour and violence, ambition and downfall, and her name still holds weight when people talk about the crack era of the mid-1980s and early 1990s. You could hear wild stories in Los Angeles, but sometimes the craziest tales came from the middle of nowhere. And that is where Lorie Arnold flipped a small Iowa town upside down. Lorie Arnold was born in 1961 and raised in Ottumwa, a working-class town that was more known for quiet streets than criminal empires. She had a brother named Tom Arnold, who eventually became a Hollywood comedian and actor, which gave her story even more attention later on. Growing up, she lived what looked like a regular Midwestern life, but the streets she touched would soon feel the same chaos as bigger cities. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Lorie got involved with bikers and small hustlers in Iowa, slowly finding her lane through methamphetamine. The drug was already making its way across the Midwest, and she saw how fast money could change her entire life. Ottumwa was no Los Angeles, but Lorie figured out how to turn a small-town network into a serious empire. She eventually married a biker named Floyd Stockdale, and together they locked in heavy with meth suppliers and local muscle. With him at her side, Lorie organized a crew that moved weight consistently and controlled large pieces of Ottumwa. At one point, she was bringing in hundreds of thousands every month, and people began calling her the Queen of Meth. Her lifestyle started reflecting the kind of money she touched. Lorie bought houses, stocked her garages with Corvettes, and even invested in racehorses that she paraded like trophies. In a town where regular folks struggled to make rent, she stood out with money that screamed power. It was not just cash and cars either, because she threw parties and moved with a confidence that made her untouchable for years. Rumors spread that she had connections with Mexican cartels and outlaw biker clubs who backed her moves. Whether all of it was true or not, her operation kept growing, and law enforcement began treating her like a regional drug queenpin. Ottumwa's quiet streets now had a reputation, and her empire became a topic across state lines. The spotlight grew even bigger because of her brother Tom Arnold. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Tom's Hollywood career was gaining steam, and reporters found the family link irresistible. Every arrest, every raid, every rumor about Lorie brought national media because she was tied to a celebrity brother. Ottumwa suddenly became a point of curiosity for people who wanted to see how a comedian's sister could control a meth empire. Federal investigators eventually closed in, hitting her with the drug trafficking and money laundering charges. Her bust was a major headline because it tied together small-town Iowa crime, biker rumors, and Hollywood gossip. Lorie received a 15-year prison sentence in 1991, and her empire fell apart under federal pressure. Her time behind bars forced her into a completely different world, leaving behind the money, the cars, and the meth empire she built from nothing. After serving her time, Lorie was released and tried to rebuild her life. But the addiction and the pull of old habits made her struggle. She relapsed into meth use again and admitted in interviews that the temptations never fully left. Her candidness made her story more raw than polished, and people saw her not just as a queenpin, but also as someone who fought demons long after the prison gates closed. Her life later became the subject of a 2021 documentary called Queen of Meth, which aired on Discovery Plus. In the series, she opened up about how she built her empire, what it cost her, and how the prison years shaped her later life. The documentary brought new eyes to her story, mixing in the glitz of her brother's Hollywood career with the gritty streets of Ottumwa. Lorie Arnold's legacy is messy, filled with fast highs, heavy falls, and lingering rumors about biker and cartel support. She showed that even a small Iowa town could birth a figure who ran meth like a corporate boss, and her name still carries weight whenever people talk about the hidden corners of America's drug trade. Delrahonda Hood, better known as Big 50, earned her stripes in Detroit at a time when the streets were boiling with opportunity and danger. The crack epidemic had flooded neighborhoods with both cash and chaos, and Detroit, already a city known for grit, became a playground for hustlers. For a woman to rise in that world, she had to be louder, sharper, and harder than the men around her. Big 50 fit that mold perfectly. Her introduction to the hustle wasn't glamorous. She started small, moving drugs, finding ways to flip quick money through scams, and learning the rhythms of the game. Detroit's underground economy rewarded boldness, and she had plenty of it. Stories from those years describe her as someone who didn't flinch, didn't bow her head, and didn't wait for permission. If there was a lane to make money, she stepped into it. Her style became part of her legend. Big 50 wasn't quiet or calculating in the shadows. She was brash, direct, and unafraid to let people know exactly who she was. She had the toughness of a street general, barking orders and setting the tone, but she also had a sharp tongue that cut down rivals and allies alike. Detroit players respected her for it, and some feared her too. She made it clear that being a woman didn't mean being overlooked. In fact, she flipped the script and demanded the same level of respect that male hustlers fought for. Money came fast, and she made sure people saw it. In Detroit's clubs, she was impossible to miss. Heavy diamonds, fur coats, hair done to perfection, and an entourage that moved with her energy. Big 50 embodied the flash of the crack era. She drove flashy cars, bought houses, and lived like the city was hers. In the nightlife scene, when Big 50 walked in, heads turned. She wasn't just spending money, she was making a statement about her place in Detroit's street hierarchy. But like every hustler's story, the streets eventually circled back. Federal charges tied to drugs and fraud landed her behind bars. Prison slowed her hustle, but it didn't erase her name. In fact, her legend grew because she was one of the few women openly associated with Detroit's underworld who carried her story with pride. When she came home, the challenges weren't just about restarting her hustle. They were about survival. Health problems, including kidney issues, forced her to live with a new awareness of mortality. Still, Big 50 found a way to turn her past into a platform. Instead of fading into obscurity, she leaned into storytelling. Her biggest spotlight came through BET's American Gangster, Trap Queens, where her life became a docudrama. She embraced it fully, laughing, cursing, crying, and showing the unpolished truth about her journey. Viewers connected because she was raw, funny, and brutally honest. She didn't glamorize the game, but she also didn't apologize for who she was. In the end, Delra Honda Big 50 Hood became more than just another name in Detroit's hustling history. She showed how street infamy could evolve into pop culture influence, and how a woman who once thrived on fraud, drugs, and flash could flip her story into entertainment and legacy. Her tale is a reminder that legends aren't always built on power alone. They're built on personality, survival, and the refusal to be forgotten. On the surface, the next woman looked like any other Chinatown shopkeeper running a modest storefront on East Broadway, selling noodles and odds and ends with a smile that never revealed the real business going on behind the counter. Her name was Chung Chui Ping, but everyone knew her as Sister Ping, the most notorious snakehead New York had ever seen. From the late 1980s into the 1990s, Sister Ping quietly built a global human smuggling empire. She became the go-to figure for thousands of Chinese immigrants desperate to leave Fujian province and find a future in the United States. Estimates suggest she arranged passage for more than 3,000 people, with fees ranging anywhere from $10,000 to $35,000 per head. For families back home, the cost meant debt, loans, or years of indentured labor. For Sister Ping, it meant millions in untaxed profits funneled through banks, storefronts, and underground networks. But the story wasn't just about money changing hands. Her methods carried a darker edge. Families who fell behind on payments were threatened. Some migrants were held hostage in safe houses until relatives wired ransom. Survivors later testified about beatings, starvation, and endless fear on the journey. Sister Ping was never seen carrying out the violence herself. She didn't have to. She hired enforcers and used her reputation to make sure the money flowed. Her network stretched across continents, from Fujian villages to Hong Kong docks, Thai jungle camps to the cramped apartments of New York's Chinatown. Sister Ping's name carried weight. She operated like a multinational CEO with one foot in the shadows. The most infamous moment tied to her empire came in 1993 with the Golden Venture tragedy. A rusting freighter carrying nearly 300 undocumented immigrants ran aground off Rockaway Beach, Queens. 10 people drowned as they tried to swim to shore, and the survivors were locked in immigration detention for years. The disaster became a national scandal, and suddenly, snakehead wasn't just a whispered word in Chinatown. It was headline news, with Sister Ping painted as the shadowy mastermind. In 2000, authorities finally caught up with her in Hong Kong. After a lengthy legal battle, she was extradited back to the US, where prosecutors laid out the scale of her operation. Ships packed like cages, passengers surviving on little food or water, and a business model built on fear and intimidation. She was convicted in 2005 and sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. Sister Ping died behind bars in 2014 at age 65. Even in death, her name split opinion. Some in Chinatown remembered her as a folk hero who gave people a chance to escape poverty and repression. Others spoke of her as a cold profiteer who exploited desperation for personal gain. Her empire crumbled, but the shadow of her name still hangs heavy over the word snakehead, a reminder of how power, profit, and survival collided in New York's underworld. While Big 50 was behind bars, another story was developing in Chicago. Chicago was bleeding heavy in the 2010s, and one teenage girl's name started echoing louder than most of the boys. Gakira Barnes, known online as K.I., was just 17 when her legend caught fire. She grew up on the South Side, tied to the STL EBT set, a crew locked in the middle of a deadly feud with O Block, one of Chicago's most notorious strongholds. Unlike most young women in that orbit, K.I. didn't stay in the background. She carried herself like one of the soldiers. Her Twitter account became infamous. She posted pictures gripping pistols and assault rifles, fired off jokes about shootouts, and clowned rivals who had just lost friends. For outsiders scrolling, it felt surreal. A teenage girl's timeline reading like a war diary mixed with teenage slang. But for those in Chicago, it was deadly serious. Every post had weight, and every name drop carried risk. The rumors came fast and never stopped. Some said she had as many as 17 bodies, a number that made her stand out in a city already drowning in young shooters. Police never confirmed that count, but they quietly admitted she was a person of interest in several homicides. To many in her neighborhood, she was a rare female assassin, a girl who could walk into the same spaces as men and command the same level of fear. But behind the bravado was trauma stacked on trauma. Friends and allies were killed one by one, and each loss hardened her. By her mid-teens, grief and revenge had blurred into the same thing. Violence wasn't just survival, it became reputation, and reputation was everything. In broad daylight, she was ambushed, shot 9 times, and left bleeding on the pavement. The killer was never officially named, but the streets immediately whispered retaliation. In a city where cycles of revenge never stop, her death was seen as just another score settled. The arguments about her life began the same day. Some painted her as a child, pulled into wars she didn't start, broken by an environment that offered no escape. Others saw her as exactly what her online persona suggested, a rising killer who lived and died by the same gun code she glorified. What nobody could deny was her impact. At just 17, she became an urban legend. Her face turned into murals, her name got locked into rap lyrics, and her story found its way into documentaries, dissecting Chicago's street wars. Gakira Barnes left behind one of the most chilling myths in modern Chicago, a teenage girl who carried herself like an assassin and whose legend still circles the block she once walked. Gakira Barnes was not the only female teenager caught up in this life of crime. Brenda Paz was barely out of her teens, but she carried secrets that could shake an entire criminal empire. Born in Honduras, she found herself tangled in the orbit of MS-13 after moving to the United States. By the late 1990s, she was more than just an associate. She was dating a high-ranking shot caller and had direct access to the inner workings of one of the most feared gangs on the continent. That proximity made her valuable, but it also made her dangerous. In 2002, when Brenda was arrested on a car theft charge, she made a choice that stunned the streets. She flipped. The FBI pulled her in, and suddenly she was feeding federal agents detailed information on MS-13 meetings, codes, operations, and even future hits. They placed her in witness protection, moving her from safe house to safe house, giving her new names and chances to restart. But Brenda couldn't stay away from the people she grew up with. She missed the chaos, the bonds, the streets that had defined her young life. She called old friends, snuck out to meet gang members, and whispered to the same men who had sworn to kill traitors. By the summer of 2003, her fate was sealed. Pregnant, only 17 years old, she was lured out near the Shenandoah River in Virginia by people she still trusted. There, she was stabbed repeatedly, her body left in the water. The killing rattled law enforcement. Multiple MS-13 members were charged and convicted, and prosecutors pointed to her betrayal as the motive. Her case eventually inspired Brenda's Law, which allowed tougher sentencing for gang-related killings of witnesses. Her death became a haunting lesson for investigators and a chilling cautionary tale inside the gang world. She had been both insider and outcast, and in the end, her refusal to cut ties with MS-13 cost her everything, including the life of her unborn child. If Brenda's tragedy showed the cost of divided loyalties, the next woman's story shows what happens when loyalty is twisted into betrayal with surgical precision. Houston already had its share of bloodshed tied to MS-13, but Carla Morales added her own stamp in 2018 with an act that was as cold as it was shocking. Carla wasn't a shot caller, but she was trusted enough to be useful. Her role wasn't to pull the trigger or swing the blade, it was to lure the target into place. And in gang culture, that job is just as deadly. Her victim was a young man she knew, another associate in the circle. The beef wasn't over drugs or money. It was sparked by a rap battle insult, the kind of petty spark that can turn fatal in a world wired for retaliation. On the day of the setup, Carla convinced him to come hang out, no different from dozens of times before. He didn't see the ambush waiting. When he arrived in Mississippi, 13 members swarmed with machetes and guns. The attack was merciless. The victim was hacked and shot, his body left as a warning to anyone watching. Police quickly pieced together her role. She wasn't the one holding the machete, but without her text messages and friendly persuasion, the murder never would have happened. By 2019, she was indicted, but Carla slipped into the wind, becoming a fugitive. For years, she dodged capture, moving through the same immigrant networks that once shielded Brenda Paz. In 2022, her run ended. Authorities arrested her, and under mounting evidence, she agreed to a plea deal. The court handed her a 30-year sentence, closing a case that prosecutors described as one of the more disturbing setups tied to MS-13 in Houston. Her story is often compared to Brenda Paz. Brenda's mistake was trying to balance both sides, loyalty to the gang and loyalty to the feds, while Carla's crime was loyalty weaponized into betrayal. Both ended in tragedy, one with a body in a river, the other with decades in a cell. For MS-13, these women became opposite cautionary tales. One showed the gang's zero tolerance for betrayal. The other proved how quickly trust could be turned into a death trap. Not all queens of the underworld built empires with bricks of heroin or stacks of meth. Some wielded their power through proximity, seduction, and a survival instinct sharpened by betrayal. Arlene Brickman was one of them, a mafia moll who traded stilettos for wiretaps when the game turned against her. Born in New York's Lower East Side in the 1930s, Brickman grew up fascinated by mob glamour. By the 1950s, she was entwined with the Colombo crime family, moving in smoky lounges, back rooms, and restaurants where made men ruled the night. Her relationships with mobsters were transactional. She hustled favors, provided companionship, and in return she basked in protection and luxury. But that protection was conditional, and in the mafia world, loyalty often dissolved when it was most needed. Brickman's disillusionment came hard. She was raped by a mob associate and realized that her pleas for justice were ignored. Later, threats against her young daughter pushed her to see the men she admired, not as glamorous anti-heroes, but as predators who would never hesitate to feed her to the wolves if it served their interests. Faced with that reality, Arlene made a radical choice. She became an informant. For years, she wore wires, attended meetings, and risked her life documenting the activities of men who thought of her as disposable. Her testimony helped convict several key figures, exposing cracks in the once impenetrable facade of mafia secrecy. Her story didn't end in obscurity. She wrote a memoir, Mob Girl, in which she laid bare the contradictions of her life, the attraction to danger, the price of survival, and the strange liberation of betrayal. Hollywood eventually circled her story for adaptation, cementing her place in mob lore as one of the rare women who didn't just orbit the mafia, but turned the tables on it. Brickman's legacy is complicated. To some, she was a traitor who violated the code of silence. To others, she was a survivor who clawed back control in a world designed to crush her. Either way, she carved her own place in the history of organized crime. Every crime legend has a partner in crime who embodies the glamour of the lifestyle. And for Frank Lucas, the Harlem heroin kingpin, immortalized in American Gangster, that partner was Juliana Farret, a former Puerto Rican beauty queen. Farret entered Lucas's orbit in the late 1960s. Together, they crafted an image of Harlem royalty: diamonds, fur coats, limousines, and seats at prize fights where the underworld mingled with celebrities. While Lucas masterminded his blue magic heroin empire, Juliana was right there, enjoying the spoils and projecting the power of a couple who had made it from the streets to the stratosphere. Her most infamous moment came at the 1971 Muhammad Ali-Joe Frazier fight in Madison Square Garden. Lucas's wife had gifted him a full-length chinchilla coat worth $100,000 with a matching $25,000 hat. The coat made them front-page news and caught the attention of federal investigators who wondered how a supposed nobody from Harlem could afford such extravagance. That coat, in many ways, marked the beginning of the end. When the empire collapsed under drug indictments in the mid-1970s, Farret wasn't spared. She was convicted and served time for her role in Lucas's network. But unlike other wives who cut ties, she returned to him after prison, a gesture of loyalty that blurred the line between devotion and recklessness. The years rolled on, and while Lucas became a semi-reformed celebrity figure in his later life, Farret could not resist temptation. In 2010, decades after the chinchilla coat scandal, she was arrested again in Puerto Rico for attempting to broker a cocaine deal. At 65 years old, she was sentenced to more prison time, a late-life reminder that crime's gravitational pull doesn't always weaken with age. Now largely out of the spotlight, Farret's legacy is inseparable from Frank Lucas's myth. She was the glamorous wife who embraced the game, who chose diamonds and loyalty, even when the price was measured in years behind bars. But if Juliana's story is about a woman who remained a supporting player in a man's empire, the next tale is the opposite: a woman who didn't just share power, but seized it, rewriting cartel history as the first woman to sit at the head of the table. In the testosterone-fueled world of the Mexican drug trade, women were often dismissed as ornaments or caretakers. Inadena Arellano Felix shattered that stereotype with quiet ruthlessness. Known as La Jefa, she became the financial brain and eventually the leader of the Tijuana cartel, one of Mexico's most violent and influential drug syndicates. Born in the 1960s into the Arellano Felix family, Inadena's destiny seemed set by bloodline. Her brothers built the cartel into a powerhouse during the 1980s and 1990s, flooding the U.S. with cocaine and battling rivals in a war that turned Tijuana into one of the most dangerous cities in the world. But while her brothers flaunted guns and women, Inadena studied accounting. She was the family's strategist, the one who understood how to launder billions, bribe officials, and keep the machinery of blood and money turning. When law enforcement and rival cartels began dismantling the male leadership through arrests, assassinations, and extraditions, Inadena stepped in. By the early 2000s, she wasn't just balancing the books, she was calling the shots. She forged alliances with remnants of Colombian cartels, diversified revenue streams, and kept the Tijuana cartel afloat, even as others crumbled under the weight of Mexico's drug war. Unlike flamboyant figures such as Pablo Escobar, Inadena cultivated invisibility. She avoided the spotlight, rarely appeared in photos, and let rumors of her ruthlessness circulate without ever confirming them. DEA officials described her as one of the most calculating and underrated cartel figures of her generation. Her gender made her an anomaly, the first woman to lead a major Mexican cartel, and yet she thrived in a role few thought possible, outlasting brothers who either died or rotted in prison. To this day, she remains at large, her name still appearing on DEA most wanted lists, a ghostly reminder that the drug war isn't just fought by men with guns, but also by women with ledgers and steel resolve. Her legacy is chilling and impressive at once, a cartel boss who understood that power in the underworld isn't just about pulling triggers, it's about moving money, commanding loyalty, and knowing when to disappear. From Harlem to Tijuana, these women shattered every notion of who could rule the underworld. Some, like Shantae Henderson and Gakira Barnes, became urban legends of violence before their youth even ended. Others, like Sister Ping and Inadena Arellano Felix, ran empires that spanned oceans and generations. A few, like Brenda Paz and Carla Morales, showed how loyalty and betrayal often blurred into the same deadly choice. And figures like Arlene Brickman and Juliana Farret proved that proximity to power could either destroy you or drag you back in, no matter the cost. Their stories swing between tragedy and myth. Murdered teenagers memorialized in hashtags, cartel queens still on the run, informants remembered less for their courage than for how their ends mirrored the danger they once embraced. Fact and folklore often collide. The rumors of buried millions, whispered hit lists, and secret alliances are part of what keeps their names alive. Yet their survival, or lack of it, define their legends more than any confirmed crime. In a world where most men eventually fell, these women forced their way into the narrative, ensuring that their names refused to die.